forward to hearing and seeing what Pat has to show for us, but I am now honored to introduce to you the state representative for this district, which is number 53. I live in a different district, but I had a wonderful conversation here just meeting Representative Malagari, and he is quite interested in the ministry of churches. He comes from the Greek Orthodox Church, and he was just interested in learning to know what we have been doing here. And I just feel so fortunate that he is here to speak, and let's hear what he has to say. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First off, I'm Representative Steve Malagari. I am born and raised here in Lansdale, actually. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning to not only learn about the shared history between Lansdale Borough and the United Methodist Church here, but it's also a wonderful morning because we're still within the days after Easter, and we're within the 40 days after. And in the Greek Orthodox tradition, where my family's from, we say Christos Anesti, which means Christ is risen. And the response is always, truly he is risen. So to you I say Christ is risen. And it's a wonderful time to be back here in this building, and you're going to learn a little bit about why it means so much to me. First, I wanted to thank Pastor Stu and Verna and Michelle for their gracious welcome, and to everybody within the congregation as well, and to our guests from the community. Thank you for being here. So I'm State Representative Steve Malagari. I represent the 53rd Legislative District. So those are the communities of Lansdale and Hatfield and Souderton and Telford, Franconia, and Salford Townships. I was born at North Penn Hospital, now Jefferson Lansdale Hospital, and raised here in town, and not far from here, actually, on East 5th Street, very close. While that might seem like a mundane detail to you at this moment, it's important as to why I'm here today. You see, as I was growing up, in my very formative years, this church, and in particular, this building, was very familiar to me. In fact, it's where my parents enrolled me in nursery school at Bright Beginnings, with my teachers, Ms. Nancy and Ms. Jackie. We even put on a play in the hall where you were just having some wonderful food, called The Three Billy Goats Gruff. And that was my first foray into acting, I guess. Later in life, it is where I would accompany my parents to vote, and where I voted for the very first time. This church is where I received my Eagle Scout Award, right there, in this very sanctuary. So Lansdale United Methodist Church means a lot to me. We know that this year is a very big year for Lansdale as we celebrate the borough's sesquicentennial, or 150 years. And I'm really pleased to be here today to celebrate an equally big milestone for the community. Lansdale United Methodist Church is, I believe, slightly older than the borough itself. And I know that Lansdale Historical Society's Pat Rieker is going to share with us the full joint history of the community very shortly. So what I wanted to do this morning is share my own congratulations and appreciation for Lansdale United Methodist Church with an official citation from the House of Representatives. So happy 150th plus one, and here's an official congratulations from the Capitol. And before that, if you didn't notice inside the hall, there was a copy of the citation from the 100th anniversary of the congregation, and that was through Representative Roosevelt Politi, I think is the pronunciation name, from 1976. And it was an amazing, amazing moment to see that. And here we are 50 years later with another citation on the longevity of this congregation. So without further ado, I'd like to read this. And to the leadership and to the congregation, whereas the House of Representatives of Pennsylvania is always pleased to acknowledge those revered places of religious worship that contribute to the well-being of their communities and ultimately to all of the people of this great commonwealth. And whereas the Lansdale United Methodist Church, established in 1871, is being honored upon the momentous occasion of its 150th anniversary, and whereas lauded as the first church in Lansdale Borough, Lansdale United Methodist Church was founded in 1871 and moved to its current location at 3rd and Broad Street in 1919. In addition to worship services, the church offers educational programs for all ages and mission outreach, presently following the spiritual guidance of the Reverend Stuart Warner. The members of Lansdale United Methodist Church have enjoyed a long history of service to God and their fellow citizens. The church has been blessed with ministers and lay people who strive to live in a manner that gives testimony to their spiritual beliefs. Their faith, determination, generosity, and stewardship have enabled the church to become a vital and inspiring presence in their community. Now, therefore, the House of Representatives of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania heartily congratulates Lansdale United Methodist Church upon the joyous celebration of its 150th anniversary, offers best wishes for a continued tradition of devoted service to God and humanity. Congratulations, and this is signed by myself, our Speaker of the House, and our Chief Clerk. So congratulations to everybody here. Do you have anyone taking pictures? There we go.
We'll go down.
We'll go down? You got it. Thank you, everyone.
Bring my camera up. Let's go down here.
Sure.
Good morning. Oops. Okay. Glasses and masks are a challenge, aren't they? I'm sure a lot of you understand that too. Thank you for welcoming me to your church for your 150th anniversary celebration. I'm really honored to be here. This special occasion has been made possible through the combined efforts of a number of people. More than anyone else, as you've heard many times this morning, Verna Colliver has been the guiding force behind this project from start to finish. Verna first approached me more than a year ago with the idea of presenting a program about the parallel histories of this church and the borough of Lansdale. Verna brought Pastor Warner and Luann Ingram to meet me at Lansdale Historical Society to iron out the details and set the date for this occasion. And later, Verna contacted me and shared documents and photos very patiently took me through your archives that we could include in our presentation here today. Other photos were provided to me by many kind people from both the Historical Society and from this church. I couldn't possibly name them all, but I thank all of you very, very much. You've been so helpful to me in preparing this program. If you have comments or questions during the program, this is very informal. Please just speak out or put your hand up and I'll try to notice you. And if you have something to add that I've missed, or if you have a question about something you see, we can talk about it. I'm very, very grateful that Lansdale's founding fathers and mothers had the wisdom to know that their town was not complete without a church. And I'm grateful to be here today to celebrate Lansdale's first church, which has supported and guided scores of Lansdale's families through good times and bad for the last 150 plus 1 years. And now this is their story and your story. Yay, technology works, I love it. When William Penn first established Pennsylvania as a colony in the 1680s, this area was almost entirely woodland, inhabited by native people called the Lenni Lenape. And this picture, of course, portrays Penn's treaty at Shackamaxon in what's now Philadelphia, where he made peace with the native people who lived here. Like Penn, other Quakers came to this area around 1700. Quakers from Wales settled in the Gwyneth area and constructed the Gwyneth Friends Meetinghouse, which still stands at the corner of Sumneytown Pike and DeKalb Pike. Followers of Caspar Schwenkfeld soon arrived from Silesia, which is not a familiar place, is it? These days, it's where Poland and the Czech Republic are located in Europe. They settled throughout Montgomery County in the early 1700s, and one of their early Schwenkfelder meeting houses was located in Tolmenson Township. The Central Schwenkfelder Church on Valley Forge Road in Worcester is one of several Schwenkfelder churches still in existence in our area. So when you go to Marymead Farm, I'm sure you know where Central Schwenkfelder Church is. Now, both the Quakers and the Schwenkfelders had faced religious persecution in Europe, and they came to Pennsylvania seeking religious tolerance. The first person to be deeded land in what is now the borough of Lansdale was a Welshman whose name was Jenkins. He came to Pennsylvania in 1729. Now, unlike their Quaker neighbors, the Jenkins family were Baptists. Jenkins and his son John likely traveled to Montgomery Baptist Church to worship. The church on Bethlehem Pike near Richardson Road was founded in a log cabin in 1719. The building now houses the congregation of the Crossroads Church. However, the graveyard behind the old Montgomery Baptist Church is still there, and many members of the Jenkins family are buried there. This one is, the person who's depicted in this gravestone is John Jenkins II, who served under General Washington in the Revolutionary War. It's still a great, if you like to go around graveyards, it's still a great graveyard to walk around. Now, Jenkins passed his land holdings on to his son John, and then his grandson John II. See if we can make that go forward. There we go. And those men built a homestead at the headwaters of the Tolmenson Creek. Many members of the Jenkins family are buried in the Montgomery Baptist Cemetery, but this is where they lived. The Jenkins homestead was finally completed about 1785, and it is now the home of the Lansdale Historical Society. So we hope you'll come and visit us sometime and learn more about the Jenkinses. 3 generations of the Jenkins family, those of John I, John II, and John III, they weren't very original when it came to names, lived on the farm before it was finally sold at public auction in 1871. Throughout most of the years that the Jenkins family lived there, the countryside changed very little. Even the main highways at the time, the Allentown Road and the Springhouse Sumneytown Turnpike, were miles away. So if you look in the red circle, it says J. Jenkins, that's the Jenkins homestead. It's the spring house at the homestead is the spring that feeds the Tomenson Creek that flows down into Tomenson Township, and eventually, I believe it flows into the Skipback Creek. The little dotted line above J. Jenkins is Welsh Road, or Main Street, as we would know it. If you come a little to the left, the road that runs perpendicular to Welsh Road is what we know as Broad Street. And if you come down toward the bottom of the map, you see there's a road that runs diagonally from middle left to lower right, and that's Allentown Road. It's labeled. It still runs diagonally, doesn't it? And at the very, very bottom, you see a broken line. That road is the Springhouse to Sumneytown Turnpike, and we know it as Sumneytown Pike. But what I wanted to illustrate here is that the farms in 1848 were very far apart from each other. There really were no major settlements in the 1840s in this area. At around the same time that the Jenkins family was putting down roots and building their farmstead in southeast Pennsylvania, a peaceful revolution of faith was gaining followers in England. John Wesley and his brother Charles Wesley were priests of the Church of England. In 1738, both brothers had conversion experiences which led them to the belief that by God's grace, justification and peace could be found through faith. This belief is the foundation of Methodism. The Wesley brothers embarked on an evangelistic enterprise which would last 50 years and reach thousands of people in England and abroad. And of course, Charles Wesley is also very well known as a hymn writer, and we still sing many of his beautiful hymns in churches today. Methodism spread to America in the 1760s, mainly in Maryland, Philadelphia, and New York City. In 1770, Hans Supplee, one of my ancestors, by the way, donated land at the corner of Skipback Pike and Bethel Road for the construction of a chapel. The church, which was non-denominational but leaned toward Methodism, was called the Supplee Chapel. And then it was torn down, and across Bethel Road on the other corner, Bethel Church was built. In 1784, it became a Methodist Episcopal church, the second oldest Methodist church in Pennsylvania. Now here's the test for all good Methodists. Where's the oldest Methodist church in Pennsylvania? Yes, it's in Philadelphia. Good for you. See, I knew you'd know that. St. George's United Methodist Church on North 4th Street in Philadelphia. If you are driving across the Vine Street Expressway, you'll actually see its roof because it's right next to the expressway. Must make for noisy Sunday morning services. I don't know. These roads on this map, many of them toll roads, were the arteries through which commerce in this region were conducted. This map is from the early 1850s. Consequently, businesses and towns such as Harleysville and Culpsville in North Wales and Springhouse grew up along the heavily traveled roads like Sumneytown Pike. And if you look at the bottom here, you can see Culpsville, and by the 1850s, there were a significant number of little squares along the road, each little square being a business or a house. So Culpsville was growing, and it was becoming a really busy little commercial center. But something was going to happen that was going to stop that growth, and that's what we're going to look at next. There it is. In the mid-1800s, technology changed the way of life for people living in this area. Travel by horse-drawn conveyance was giving way to faster modes of transportation, specifically train travel. And here's a picture of Matthias Baldwin's, one of his early engines. Of course, Baldwin built a locomotive works in Philadelphia that for decades turned out locomotives that were sold all over the world. He was very famous for building his locomotives. Then in 1853, a really defining event happened in this area. A fledgling railroad company named the North Penn Railroad decided to build a new route from Philadelphia to the Lehigh Valley. The chief surveyor of the railroad, Philip Lansdale Fox, plotted a relatively direct path from Philadelphia to Bethlehem. And here we see Philip Lansdale Fox in his Union Army uniform. He was an officer in the Union Army, and as you've probably guessed, he gave his middle name to our town. A spur line was to be built from the main line of the railroad to Doylestown. Philip Lansdale Fox was dispatched to find a place for the junction of the two lines, and the rest, as they say, is history. If we look at the map of what later became Lansdale, the straight track goes to Bethlehem, the railroad track that curves off to the right goes to Doylestown, and there we are right at the junction. Well, Philip Lansdale Fox decided that this was a good place because there was such a sparse population right here, and no one would complain that we were building a railroad junction right in the middle of their farmland. Besides which, the soil in this area was clay, as I'm sure many of you who've tried to garden in Lansdale know, and was unsuitable for growing anything. In fact, the area was known at the time as the Mud Hole. A rather inauspicious beginning for our town. Within months, a little village sprang up around the railway junction and a permanent settlement was established. Service businesses such as hotels and general stores soon followed. So if we're looking at this picture, this is about the oldest picture we have of Lansdale at the Lansdale Historical Society. We're looking north on the Bethlehem branch of the tracks. And the road that runs right across the middle of the picture is Welsh Road or Main Street. The train station is actually the second train station that was in Lansdale. The first was nothing more than just a modified boxcar that was done away with, and then a permanent station was built. This station in the picture was took care of both freight and passengers. And then it was torn down when the current station was built in the early 1900s. Across the tracks, there was already a hotel built. The American House Hotel was there, and there was a feed and grain mill where Madison parking lot once used to be, not that long ago. After the rail line finally opened in 1856, the pace of development quickened. One matter needed to be settled in a hurry. The little village needed a name to attach to its new train station. The residents fondly remembered their affable surveyor. Many of them had gotten to know Philip Lansdale Fox, and he must have been a really nice guy from all we can tell, very friendly type of person. And they settled on his middle name as a good name for our train station, and that's how our little borough got its name. Now, the proximity of the railroad paid big dividends in Lansdale's early growth. It was a magnet for new business, the most important of which was the Hebner Agricultural Works, which was housed in a plant adjacent to the Broad Street crossing of the railroad. This would be where Vespia's tire service is today. Hebner's became the world's largest manufacturer of horse-powered farm equipment. Now, horsepower is exactly what it said. The horse walked on a treadmill, and they sold the treadmills, and then it turned the gears of the machinery that did your farm work for you in days before most farms had any electricity or any other way of powering their equipment. Workers from near and far came to Lansdale seeking jobs, and they brought their families with them. The new residents of the village needed services, and by 1870, Lansdale had a bank and a post office. They were located where the Wells Fargo Bank is now, and a newspaper, which was also in West Main Street. A school was planned, and it was built within the year. But there was still one problem. There were no churches in this town. Workers were reluctant to move their families to a town where there was no church. So Dr. John Jacobs, known as the Daddy of Lansdale, stepped up with a solution. Dr. Jacobs owned a large tract of land east of the railroad, and he wanted to sell building lots. He donated a parcel of land at what is now the northeast corner of 3rd and Walnut Streets to be used for the construction of a church. Now, a few things need to be explained on this map, I guess. First of all, you can see how much land Dr. Jacobs owned, because everything from the railroad east to Broad Street and everything from Main till about 7th Street, this whole parcel of land that's around your church here, belonged to Dr. Jacobs. And he had subdivided all of it for building lots. He really wanted to sell them. His motivation in offering land to build a church was not that he wanted a church. He never did join this church. But his motivation was he wanted to bring people here to sell his building lots, and he saw that he really needed a church, and so that's why he gave the land. Dr. Jacobs had served in the Army Medical Corps during the Civil War, And after the war, Dr. Jacobs gave up the practice of medicine and moved to Lansdale, where he built a beautiful home at West 4th Street and Broad Street, right where your Sunday school building is today. He became a banker and a prominent member of the community. Dr. Jacobs was known as the daddy of Lansdale, and as far as we know, he never became a member of this church. Or we're not sure he became a member of any church. In 1871, Dr. Jacobs approached the Reverend Hiram U. Sebring, the Methodist circuit preacher, about beginning a church in Lansdale. Reverend Sebring appointed a committee of 6, including Dr. Jacobs and Lansdale businessmen Isaac and William Hebner, remember Hebner's Agricultural Works, to act as a board of trustees. Reverend Sebring, like Dr. Jacobs, was a veteran of the Civil War. And there you can see his veteran's burial card up in the upper right-hand corner where it names his regiment, where he served. Most of his service was in the South, in the southern part of this country. And also Reverend Sebring's grave in Alverson, Pennsylvania, where he grew up. That was his hometown. I wanted to point out to you, too, down in the lower right-hand corner is a page I found that is from the ledgers of your church. And it shows the payment of pastors in the early years of your church. So the first name is H.U. Sebring, which is Hiram Sebring. He was pastor from 1872 to 1873, and they had budgeted $500 to pay him for the year. So, if you think about that, that's less than $10 a week. That's not a lot of money. Even in 1872, that was not a lot of money. But what they actually paid him was $407 and change, which was a whole lot less money than that. So in those days, pastors depended very heavily on the charity of their congregations. If you were canning peaches, you gave some to the pastor. If you had cast-off children's clothing that your kids had outgrown, you gave them to the pastor for the pastor's children. So it was difficult to be a pastor. You really had to depend on a congregation that was going to be somewhat generous. And this was Reverend Sebring. And so, under Reverend Sebring, the church began as a charge of the Montgomery Square, North Wales Circuit. The Montgomery Square Methodist Church was the parent church to Methodist churches in North Wales, Ambler, and Lansdale. Construction of the Lansdale church began in the spring of 1871, and I hope you've gotten to see the cornerstone of the 1871 church. It's on display, I believe, in the Springer Auditorium. If you haven't gotten to see that, you should look at it before you go. On July 14, 1872, the church building was dedicated. We don't have a photo of the exterior of the church as it looked that day. This is a photo of the front of the sanctuary. The building was completed the evening before the dedication, and the Lansdale Reporter commented, and this is a quote, "The church is not and was not intended to be a grand structure, but it is neat, well-proportioned, and made of the best materials. We heard the opinion frequently expressed during the day that this was as fine-looking a church edifice as may be found along the North Penn Railroad." Between 1878 and 1894, the church building was remodeled and expanded. Real stained glass windows replaced the imitation ones at a cost of $5,000. That was a lot of money for a little church in those days. It'd be a lot of money for a church today. The renovation of the church building was described as follows. The front end was torn out and run 18 feet to the sidewalk. And I believe that's when the cornerstone was probably removed, when they tore out that front wall. Okay. Let me find my place here. A beautiful stone front and tower was erected, elegant designs of stained glass placed for the windows of the new part. A slate roof was put on the whole building. The entire edifice is lighted by electric lights and heated by steam. Now, remember, when this church was originally built, there was no plumbing inside, no running water or bathrooms, no heat, and there would have been no lights. They probably had oil lights, and they probably had a stove in the sanctuary that would keep people warm in the wintertime. Well, sort of keep people warm in the wintertime. If you haven't seen, there is an example of one of the original stained glass windows up here on your communion table, your altar in the front. the little round stained glass window here was from the original church. Oh, I'll do that. It's been a long time since I've been an acolyte. Very long time. Okay, let's see if we can move this forward now. See, I walked away. Now this isn't going to work. There we go. Just take one. The church attracted many new members in these years as more and more families came to Lansdale in search of a livelihood and a secure place to live. An example of these families is the Wright family. George and Margaret McLaughlin Wright were married in Philadelphia in 1885 at St. Anne's Church in Port Richmond. We found this marriage certificate. It was actually donated to us in the Historical Society. And we wondered about its connection to Lansdale. It turns out that this young couple moved to Lansdale, where George sought work in his trade as an iron molder at Abram Cox Stove Company, which is on North Cannon Avenue. In fact, you can still see the painting of the name of the company on the side of the building right next to the railroad if you drive down North Cannon Avenue. In fact, we think that George Wright probably worked for Abram Cox when it was in Philadelphia. They moved their operation out here to be closer to the railroad right around the same time the Wrights got married. And so I assume they probably followed the company, followed the work, and came out here. Over time, the Wright family had 8 children, and they became members of the Lansdale Methodist Episcopal Church. They were representative of many working-class families who joined this church in the early years. And these would have been people of all denominations, because remember, this was really the only church in town, so people from every denomination joined. Soon, back at the church, an organ was added, donated by Isaac Hebner. And a parsonage was built next door. It's kind of an unusual-looking parsonage there, right next door. At this time, there were many church services every Sunday. Between 9 in the morning and 9 at night, services followed one another, one after the other, beginning with Sunday school and preaching, followed by youth programs in the afternoon, more preaching in the evening. Then there were midweek services and youth meetings. At this time, people's social life revolved around the church. This is where you went to see your friends. This is where you went to do things and meet up and have a good time all week long, not just on Sundays. There were very few other distractions around in those days. And there were, of course, weddings. In the late 19th century, most weddings, at least around here, took place in the home of the bride or in the parsonage. However, the more prominent families had church weddings. One such couple was U.S. Grant Jenkins and his bride, Cora Shaw, who were wed November 15, 1893, at the Methodist Episcopal Church. Jenkins was a successful plumber, and he was credited with installing most of the plumbing and heating system at William Penn Inn. Grant and Cora raised their family as members of this church. The first 2 decades of the 20th century were a time of growth and revival for the church. A postcard we recently found tells us of the church in the early 1900s. A woman named Gertrude W. invites a friend to attend a concert at the Lansdale ME Church, that's this church, and the concert's going to be at Pleasantville Church in Eureka. And there, I can't read that far, unfortunately, but at the bottom I transcribed the message where she says that the choir is a-goin' to have a concert. I like a-goin' to have a concert. Well, we're not sure really who Gertrude W. was, but it's likely that she was Gertrude Hillpot Wheeler, who was a very active member of this church and active in the musical groups of this church in the early 1900s. She was a talented musician, and she played the piano in various church and community events. She and her husband, Charles Wheeler, a pharmacist, moved to North Wales around 1920 when he set up his drugstore down there, Wheeler's Pharmacy, and they transferred their membership at that time to North Wales ME Church. There she is. I love that portable piano. I didn't know they had anything like that in those days. She played, in this picture, she's with the Lansdale Orchestra. In Lansdale, it soon became evident that a larger church would be needed. The old church building was sold to the Moose Lodge for $10,000. Because of the high cost of building materials, probably due to World War I, it was deemed impractical to start building the new church. And so the church was without a building for a while, so they ended up renting their old building back from the Moose. Maybe they sold too soon, I don't know. And services continued to be held there. Then in 1919, land was purchased at 3rd and Broad Streets, and on a Sunday evening in August, a groundbreaking ceremony for the new church was held in a downpour of rain. After the ground was broken, the festivities were moved indoors at the old church at 3rd and Walnut. Construction of a new church building began under the supervision of William Hebner. Now, I know this is not your church. He modeled the design of this church on a church in DeLand, Florida, which he attended when he traveled to his estate there each winter. Hence, we have a California mission-style church in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. Now, this doesn't look exactly like your church, but I do think that tower bears a striking resemblance to your tower. I think they're very much the same, and maybe that's what William Hebner was looking at when he designed this church. Let's pause a moment and remember William and Isaac Hebner. The brothers were raised in Worcester. They attended the Schwenkfelder Church, and then they moved to Lansdale in the 1860s to operate the Hebner Agricultural Works with their father, David Hebner. In 1871, the Hebner brothers served on the Board of Trustees charged with building this church, or the church down at 3rd and Walnut. Both of the brothers were instrumental in the growth of the new church. Let's look at them individually. Here's Isaac. He was a machinist and the first of the brothers to arrive in Lansdale. He built a machine shop, and he and his wife, Catherine, established a home near Main and Broad Streets soon after their marriage in the early 1860s. So I don't know if you can see that, it's kind of tiny, but that Main and Broad Street, right where the Rite Aid drugstore is today, is where Isaac and Catherine built their home, and right behind it was his machine shop, which later became the Agricultural Works. Isaac Hebner built a spacious and beautiful home at the corner of Main and Broad Streets. He and his family lived there only about 4 years. It seems that Isaac's family had simpler tastes, and he sold the house and moved to a smaller home. The larger home eventually became the Hotel Tremont, and this is right at the same place where the Rite Aid drugstore is at Main and Broad Street today. Isaac Hebner, who's the little blue arrow is pointing right to the top of his head there, donated the first organ to the Methodist Episcopal Church, and he also became the organist for more than 40 years. We're not sure what this group is. We do know it is a group from the Methodist Episcopal Church. We know a couple of people in this picture, including Isaac Hebner, but we don't know anything more about it. So I wish we knew some more names, and maybe it's a musical group, a choir perhaps? I don't know. I'd like to find out someday. Though Isaac was less active in the agricultural business than his brother, he left an indelible mark on the community by heading the public school board for 40 years. Under his leadership, both the Broad Street and Green Street schools were built. He was indeed the father of Lansdale's school system. Now, his younger brother, William Hebner, was 8 years younger than Isaac, and as a young man, he worked as an apprentice in his brother's machine shop. Soon thereafter, the brothers were joined by their father, David Hebner, and together they built the Hebner and Sons Agricultural Works behind Isaac's home on South Broad Street. William eventually became the owner and operator of the busy plant. In 1872, he married Emma France at Wentz's Church in Worcester. The couple had 3 children before Emma's death following an illness in 1881, and then 2 years later, he married Elizabeth Shearer, who was 15 years younger than he was, at the Methodist Episcopal Church right down there at 3rd and Walnut in Lansdale. William built a home at the corner of South Broad Street and Jenkins Avenue. This building still stands today, and it is now Montella's Sports Pub and Bar. Sports Bar and Pub, I guess they call it. And you can really see the looks of the old house there, even though it's been modified somewhat to become a restaurant. William Hebner served as choir master of the Lansdale Methodist Church for more than 50 years. William Hebner was elected to 2 terms as representative to the state legislature. During his tenure, he was credited with spearheading the campaign to preserve Valley Forge Park as a state park. In 1976, it became a national park and has been spared from development due to William Hebner's efforts. So it just shows what one person can do and how long that person's effect may last. We can only imagine what Valley Forge Park would look like today if William Hebner had not made the effort to save it. It would probably all be developed by now. When a Schwenkfelder church was finally built in Lansdale in 1916, William Hebner contributed a significant amount of money for its construction in honor of his father David, who had remained a Schwenkfelder throughout his life. William remained a member of this church, even though he had donated a lot of money to that church. Now, while we've been sidetracked with the Hebners, construction has been completed on the 3rd and Broad Street Church. On June 5th, 1921, the new church building of the Methodist Episcopal Church was dedicated. The congregation at that time numbered 500, and that's the building we're sitting in right now. A new organ and deacon chimes were given as a memorial to Isaac Hebner from his brother William Hebner. Isaac had died in 1918, and he never saw the new church. In 1921 to 22, the church celebrated its 50th anniversary, as did the borough of Lansdale. Reverend Bruce McKay, pastor of the Methodist Episcopal Church, penned a song in honor of the dual occasion. Gem of Montgomery was and still is Lansdale's favorite, not favorite, but official song. I don't think it's the favorite because I don't think anybody knows it. Official song. In his lifetime, Pastor McKay composed more than 300 hymns and songs. Oh, there he is. I'm sorry, I didn't change the slide there. And that's Pastor McKay. And there's his song, Gem of Montgomery. No, and I'm not going to sing it for you today. If you'd like to have the sheet music, we have it at the Historical Society, and maybe you'd like to take it home and play it on your piano. Pastor McKay also began a publication called The Weekly Calendar, which combined the orders of service for the Sunday morning and evening services, schedules of other meetings, news items, and announcements. It was edited by the pastor and printed on the press of one of the local newspapers. The weekly calendar was published until 1974, when it was replaced by the Circuit Rider, which I'm sure is a document you're all familiar with. Now, in the 1920s, Sunday school was very well attended, and there were classes for people of all ages, with attendance at all Sunday school classes on a given Sunday as high as 400 members. At that time, attendance in Sunday school was greater than attendance in church services. This was a time when Sunday school took on a new look. And these photos are really great. They're a picture of a Rally Day parade that was held. Many of you will remember Rally Day, and I'm not sure if we still call it that, but it's in September when everyone comes back after the summer and gets back into the church activities and routine of the church for the winter time. At one time, all the Sunday schools in Lansdale, because by this time there were a lot of other churches in Lansdale, would have a whole long Rally Day parade where it would start at one church and they'd snake around the town and pick up the other Sunday schools along the way and make a big parade to Memorial Park where they would have a big picnic and celebration together. Those were different times. The Methodist Episcopal Church, was on the cutting edge of this new wave of Christian learning, having recently opened a small Sunday school wing in its new church. Other churches would follow with Sunday school facilities of their own. Now, as Lansdale celebrated its semi-centennial in 1922, the borough was becoming a modern 20th century business hub. 2 trolley lines converged in the center of town, and new commercial buildings, such as the building which housed the First National Bank and the post office, replaced older, outdated structures. And that would have been right where the Wells Fargo Bank is today. Before 10 years had even passed, with the boom of the 1920s, okay, let's switch here. Oh, having a little trouble with the clicker here. There it goes. I just have to give it the magic touch. The boom of the 1920s resulted in several new and important buildings in Lansdale, and here we see that the bank, within 10 years, was remodeled again. This time, it was just a bank, and the post office had moved out. And we also had the new Lansdale High School on Penn Street, and the new Lansdale Theater, which featured talkies and air conditioning. We're really moving into that 20th century, aren't we? Prosperous times allowed a number of residents of Lansdale to build vacation cabins at Camp Oaks along the Unami Creek near Finland in Bucks County. Many of the residents of Camp Oaks were members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. A pavilion was built near the banks of the creek, and Sunday services were held there during the summer months for many years. And I borrowed this painting from Nancy Schmidt, one of your members, who very graciously let me have a picture of it. She has this hanging in her home. One of her neighbors at Camp Oaks painted the picture, Bud Patrick, back in 2004, I believe. And it really depicts the little Sunday school pavilion very nicely. How many of you have ever worshiped up at Camp Oaks? We have quite a few. Yeah, it's really a nice place to be on a Sunday morning, I think, in the summertime. Well, that was the end of prosperity. Along came Reverend Beck, and a couple of months after he became pastor, the stock market crashed, and it was 1929. This is Reverend Paul Beck, and this is his family at, is it Beach Haven, I think? It's at the seashore in New Jersey. And I'll let you have a minute to look at that. I don't know if you can read that or not. It's pretty distant. But they look like they're having a good time at the shore and looking forward to getting back to Lansdale and resuming Sunday school and church activities. Now, even though Lansdale's industrial base allowed for many residents to keep their jobs during the Depression definitely affected all families. The church experienced hard times as well. In financing its summer Bible school in 1934, $250 had been budgeted for the 3-week Bible school, but contributions came up short. With careful budgeting, though, the school did become a success. And these were typical of the types of Bible school materials that children would have used back in those days. You'd get a little folder with a Bible story in it and maybe some activities on the back that you could do at home, and you get to take that home with you. Technology has changed in Bible school too, hasn't it? As the country recovered from the Depression, additional renovations were made to the church in 1937. The local newspaper commented that the church was, quote, one of the most beautiful in the North Penn area, and I can only just echo that because you indeed do have a beautiful church here. After the church mergers in 1939, the church's name was changed to Lansdale Methodist Church. The congregation barely had time to take a deep breath when the country was again immersed in hard times. Many of the young people of our community went to war. At the church, the Women's Society for Christian Service sent packages to the men and women who were in service. In December 1941, they sent Christmas boxes to 11 servicemen and 2 nurses. The boxes consisted of a Bible, writing materials, a comb, lifesavers, a puzzle, honey hash cookies, and a Christmas card, of course. I looked for a recipe for honey hash cookies, and I couldn't find one, but maybe that's a Lansdale Methodist Church tradition, I don't know. With the end of the war years, the church began a long-planned expansion. In 1954, renovations were made to the church and the Sunday school auditoriums. The property at 17 West 3rd Street, which would have been the old parsonage behind the church, and the elegant former home of Dr. Jacobs at 4th and Broad were purchased and later demolished in 1958 to make room for a new education building and for additional parking. When this church was built, most people walked to church. But after World War II, that all changed. People didn't want to walk to church anymore. They wanted to drive their cars. And there was no place to park except on the street. So parking was a huge issue for churches that were in town. And I'm sure you still experience that as an issue today, as many of the in-town churches do. In 1959, the cornerstone was laid for the education building, and in February 1960, the building was dedicated. Then, surprisingly, in December 1962, just 2 years later, the Lansdale Methodist Church Messenger noted, quote, "It may seem amazing to many of our members that we have outgrown our new church school building." It's hard to believe, isn't it? It was brand new, and 2 years later they had outgrown it. Plans are being made to enlarge the sanctuary, renovate the basement of the church building, build a new parsonage on Elm Drive, and provide new parking facilities. This was the baby boom. This was a time when families were coming back to church and they had a lot of children and they were bringing them along. So we needed a big Sunday school building and we needed large church facilities and lots of parking. At the time when the church needed a strong and faithful pastor to lead during a time of growth and change, the Lord sent exactly the right person, Reverend Dr. B. Burns Broadhead. Dr. Broadhead served this church from 1968 to 1980. He was amiable and warm-hearted and much loved by the congregation. He is fondly remembered for his trumpet accompaniments to hymns. In this photo, Dr. Broadhead is displaying one of the beautiful needlepoint kneeling cushions, which were designed and stitched by members of this congregation in the 1980s. Reverend A. Richard Weand, a lifelong member of this church, was called to be associate pastor in 1974. And this was rather unusual because in most Methodist churches, a pastor who lives in the community or is a member of the church is not called to be the pastor of that church. But this was an exception, and he served very well. He served for 10 years and was the first editor of the monthly newsletter, The Circuit Rider. He later became chaplain at North Penn Hospital. On Sunday, February 13th, 1977, the church celebrated a service of dedication, officiated by Bishop James Alt. Reverends Broadhead and Weand assisted, as well as former pastors Leslie Kiefer, George N. Hipple, and J. Vincent Watchhorn. The service was the climax of the extensive building program of the previous 15 years. In 1984, major improvements were again undertaken at the church, including an air conditioning system, outside ramp, and accessible restrooms. The old church was changing with the times as its 125th anniversary approached. To commemorate the occasion, a beautiful quilt was made and ringed with the signatures of members. I hope you all got to see that as you were eating your breakfast down in Stringer Auditorium. It's hanging up high near the ceiling. As the 20th century came to a close and the new century dawned, the church was full of life and activity. Youth and their leaders found fun and fellowship by building and renovating homes for neighbors in need around the country. Here at home, there were Sunday school classes for all ages. There are some of the children getting their Bibles. The children would look forward to a treat every Sunday, courtesy of the church's Goodwill Ambassador, George Hecker. I can hear that many of you remember him fondly. There he is, flipping his pancakes and greeting the children, which he loved to do. I went through school with Mr. Hecker's son, so I know he is a really nice guy. Members of the chancel choir made a joyful noise on Sunday mornings, as did the Crusader choir, and they were joined by the sweet voices of the cherubs. The teens entertained with their youth musical productions, and this one's called WWJD, What Would Jesus Do? And it was presented in 2000. By 2003, well, here we go again, the building is undergoing another major renovation. I must say, you folks renovate your church more than anybody I know. There are a lot of building changes, but you're right in there keeping up with the times, which is wonderful. And this renovation added an elevator, a relocated ramp over to the 4th Street side where it is now, and an updated kitchen. And that's pretty much what the church looks like today. The 10 years that followed brought events for fundraising, like the rummage sale, picking out a little treasure there. I'm not sure that skirt really fits, but that's okay. And events for fun, like the church league softball games. Christmas time brought opportunities for outreach to the community, such as gifts for children at a local school and caroling with seniors at Dock Woods Community. An annual favorite was the live nativity on the church lawn. And so from 3rd and Walnut to 3rd and Broad, through every season of the year, for a century and a half, this has been a church for every generation. Happy 150th to Lansdale's first church, Lansdale First United Methodist Church. Your story is indeed still unfolding. Thank you. Did anyone have a comment or a question or something you'd like to reflect on about your experience here at Lansdale United Methodist? A quiet group. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat, for that wonderful story. Lots of memories. Please, some of you have already shared your stories. If you still have a story to share, on the table right outside, there are forms for you to do that. I also want to remind you that as you leave outside Stringer, on that table is some information about the Lansdale Historical Society. And I know, I had a tour of the Jenkins homestead. It is fascinating to see all of the rooms as they are arranged with items and furniture from the past. So, and even touring the Historical Society itself is a great experience. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and you might want to stop by again in Stringer Auditorium if you haven't seen all of those things out on the table. And I will put the commemorative certificate that Representative Malagari gave us. I'll put that there if you'd like to take a close look at it. Thank you very much.